So I want to give another example that is an example about a collective sensing and co-sensing that shifted a community or a context into a very deep space of beloved community. And so this is an example from a presencing workshop. It was a master's class, so it was a group of people who spent about 2 years together learning the various skills of sensing.
Every now and then.
Every now and then, yes. It was, yeah. So, you know, periodic gatherings. And we were actually on our last session. And I want to back up and say that, you know, kind of sort of some of the overarching lessons for me that came out of this. And so the first was that over a period of time of building relationships together, we had created a space of trust that was quite hardy and resilient and deep. And I think that that is an important factor in this story.
So that was a group of how many?
So it was a group of about 72 people, though I have to say it felt much more intimate than that. If you'd asked me, I would have said 30. Context is very important. We were in Berlin. And Berlin, a number of us in the room described Berlin as kind of a gateway. And so in this room, there were a number of Germans in Berlin and a number of American and actually non-American Jews. And so there was, again, this idea of the social field. Boy, the roots and the seeds were just right under the surface, though a lot of us actually could not feel that. And over the course of a couple of days, this presence in the room kept kind of coming up and then dipping down and coming up and dipping down. And it was only when a few people had the courage to sort of name it and to kind of presence it for the rest of the room that people began to feel it. The room began to feel it. And so there was a moment when a few people just kind of noted that, you know, this is Berlin. And it was almost like you could feel those words, this is Berlin. You could just feel the crack opening, the emotional outpouring. People began to cry, just burst into tears in the room. And then person after person began to tell the most extraordinary stories of suffering and pain. And, you know, in that space, there was suddenly room. It wasn't complaining. It was sharing like the deepest parts of people's humanity. And what had been created in the space was permission and support and love to share these stories in a way that, if you were religious, you would say was redemptive. But you might otherwise say was just so deeply nurturing and caring and loving. And so these stories came out. And one of the stories that was so striking to me was from a woman whose mother had been a Holocaust survivor. And she was an American. She went to the United States, raised her children in the US. And when her children asked her about the Holocaust, she had been in Bergen-Belsen, I believe. And when they asked her about it, the only thing she would talk about was the day that the camp was liberated. And the story she told was that Germans lined the streets and were weeping as people came out of the camp. she never talked about her suffering in the camp. She only talked about the open-heartedness of the German people. And it was so striking to me that I, as an African-American woman, had told a very different story to my children about racism. I had not told them redemptive stories. I had told them stories to stoke their anger, because for me, that had been the most important thing. I felt that I had to protect them. And I actually went home that night and called my son in the US and told him the story. And he said, "You did the right thing, Mom, to keep us angry." And it was so striking to me. I realized that I had done the wrong thing. But I want to back up and tell another part of the story first. So the night before, I had been sitting with some of my friends, one of whom is a very close friend, a German woman. And because this had been brewing in the room for a couple of days, in this smaller group of women, we were talking about the experience of being German in the world. And she was telling the story of how painful it could be to be German in the world, and how people didn't really make space for that experience. And as she was talking, I was getting angrier and angrier, and feeling actually that she had no right to speak. And all I could think about was, at one point she said, you know, in Germany at a very young age, you are made to learn the story of the war. And it's too early for us. And without even thinking about what she was saying, I said, well, how young do you think you are as a Jew to learn that story? There was no empathy for her at all. And when I said it, she didn't say anything back to me. But and then I proceeded to tell my stories about, well, you should try to be an African American and try to raise black boys in this society. And you don't know what it's like to have your husband stopped every other week by the cops. Do you know what driving while black, you know what that is? And you know, that is really a sad experience. And I was telling this to the whole group, and as I was talking, I could see her like sinking further and further into the chair. She didn't say anything, she just sat there. And all of a sudden I looked over and I realized, I mean, this is a very dear friend of mine, that was another form of savagery. That I was doing to her what I had done to the woman that I was deposing, and it was the same source. It was this kind of anger that just obliterates people's humanity. And so the next day, walking into that room and feeling that a space had been created that enabled people to share these things and be loved, not savaged. It was an extraordinary moment that, it was the first time I had really directly, deeply experienced a beloved community. And it was because people in the room were attending to the field, to cultivating this open heart, to the possibility that you could actually connect directly, heart to heart with another person and just receive their pain and love them. Love them.
So thank you, Dayna, for bringing that experience back. I want to make an observation and then also ask you, because you can say, yeah, it was like a, it certainly was an earth-shattering experience for everyone being part of the group, but then, and we described some more of that in the 5th chapter of the Leading from the Emerging Future book. But then you can say, but so what? So what's really the impact of that? So I want to ask you personally, kind of whether, so was that a one-off, or kind of how, what is from today's perspective? So how do you look back at that? But before coming to that, I would like to just add an observation, which is, it's interesting, kind of there was something happening in this larger field of 72 or so individuals. I remember kind of, and then the smaller seedings of that event, right? So you mentioned the story the night before that happened. I also, with another group, had the night before a meeting, and we actually had like a coaching group. We had like one Jewish American, kind of another Jewish participant from Israel, then another Jewish American, now that I think about that, and a Buddhist participant from East Asia, and another American participant. That was our group. So we had like many of which, you know, played a very important role in holding that space. So it wasn't just something that happened by accident, but it was actually an experience that was about to happen. You could feel it like weeks. I mean, you could feel the seeds of that in the making for a long time. And we even talked about that a little earlier. And it was not just one place; it was several places. You were at one, I was another one, and there was probably even more. So that's also interesting when you look at something, you know, a collective shift happening, the collective field shifting. There are these seeds, often unseen. It's smaller groups, it's kind of deeper personal work. In your case, it was this really seeing your friend and becoming aware of that other level. You started to see your seeing. It's not only seeing her sinking down in the chair, but realizing it was me. What am I doing here? So it's kind of the second level of awareness that you also described earlier.
Yeah.
Often, we see other people sinking down the chair and don't think anything.
Right.
So what happens when you begin to pull yourself up and to notice that from another level? So how is that?
So the key sensing organ there is the open heart. And I know that sounds abstract, but it is actually almost physical. That when your heart is open, you see the person in front of you without, you know, the anger falls away, all of the assumptions that you might make, and all of the protective mechanisms that you might erect just melt away. And it's for me, it is a very physical sensation. And so you asked before whether this was a one-off, and, you know, after that, did I drop back down again and go back to work? And actually, no, I did not. That room the night before and the room the next day, for me, created an opening of the heart that continued and continues to this day. And so I think there is a way in which you, that once a gate opens through a process like that, and you continue to pay attention, it actually, for me, it has not been possible to close that gate again. And in fact, it just becomes more open. And this sounds abstract, but for me, it was as if a new organ inside of me emerged. And it was like there was a shell that cracked open. And it's right here, I can feel it. And it has actually changed my relationships in the world permanently. I mean, that was 2 years ago, I think. And my family has noticed it. My children have noticed it in particular. And the way they describe it is that I'm more relaxed. I'm less intense. I listen to them more. I pay attention more. And it has to do with ability to step back, see yourself as you are interacting, but also to see others with an open heart, to really connect, you know, in that moment, in that room on the second day when there was this opening, a collective opening for everybody. I looked across the room at my friend and I felt a physical connection. I felt like there was a cord from my heart to hers. It was very direct. And you know, you can talk as if this is metaphor. It didn't feel metaphorical in that moment. And I'm saying this to say that I think that there's actually some science underneath this. I don't think this is some metaphysical or some imagined fantastic process. I think if you can open up your sensing organs and just see yourself and see other people with an open heart and an open mind, of course, that this is what can emerge. And you can teach people, you can learn how to do this. To me, that is the purpose of presencing and the tools of sensing and co-sensing.